welcome back to Manual RedEye. I'm Sam Payne-Young, and this is RedEye Reviews. As a casual sci-fi enjoyer, I think it's really easy to see the genre as like a bunch of white guys in their mom's basements, but we all know that's not true, and sci-fi is a super diverse genre. And there are plenty of popular black sci-fi authors today, but I want to talk about a different side of that. In honor of Black History Month, today I'm going to be talking about two early sci-fi books by African American authors. Both books provide a look into important moments in Black history through the lens of science fiction, and these books represent the beginning of the vast contributions to the genre by Black authors. So we're starting off at the very, very beginning with Blake or the Huts of America, which is considered to be the first sci-fi novel written by an African American author. So this book was written by Martin Delany, who was born in 1812. In what is now Charleston, West Virginia, but it was Virginia when he was born, to a free woman and an enslaved man, so his father was actually enslaved. But he moved to Pennsylvania in his childhood. Delany was very studious, and he taught himself through reading and writing, and he also worked to pay for his own studies. And then at 19, he moved to Pittsburgh, where he became a physician, and he got more involved in politics later in his life. The book is serialized, and it was published between 1859 and 1862 in different magazines. Although the book wasn't actually published in full and edited together until 1970, and some of the last chapters were lost, so unfortunately the story is incomplete. The story follows Henry Blake, who was born free but was later enslaved after his wife Maggie is sold, separating their family. He escapes, and the rest of the book follows his journey organizing a mass slave revolt in the American South. I would say that this book is worth giving a read just because of how radical it was for its time. And while it didn't get a lot of attention back then, there is a lot of modern discussion about it because it was compiled and re-released, which is pretty interesting. And I really enjoyed reading some of the articles about it while I was researching the book. In terms of the book itself, I did find it kind of hard to read, partially because it's pretty wordy, and partially because it was originally meant to be a serialized novel, which makes the pacing sort of weird. But even though I found it challenging, I think it's definitely worth reading, and I'm honestly surprised that I don't hear it talked about more often, just because it's such a unique book, and it's the first African-American sci-fi novel ever written, and it was written in the build-up to and during the Civil War. The next book we have is Of One Blood by Pauline Hopkins. Hopkins was born in Maine, but she lived for most of her adult life, at least in Boston, Massachusetts. And she was from a pretty prominent household, so she was encouraged to get a good education. And she talked later about how she was inspired by civil rights activists that she saw during her youth. She actually had a pretty interesting career outside of just this book. She was an actress and a singer, and she also wrote plays and essays, and she was the editor of a magazine. This book was the last of 3 serialized novels that she published in the Colored American magazine while she was their editor. I'm going to try not to spoil this too much as I review it because there are a lot of plot twists, but basically the story centers around Raoul, who's a medical student, and he's mixed, but he passes for white. So most of the book he's kind of indifferent to his heritage. So his close friend / kind of assistant, but not really, Aubrey, is hey man, you need to get out of the house, you're just sad, you're lonely, come with me to this concert. So then at this concert he meets a woman named Diane, and he's immediately, he falls super in love with her, this is the most gorgeous woman ever. And then later on this night he gets a spectral vision of her that comes to him and tells him that she needs his help. So then fast forward to the next morning, and he's called to help a bunch of people who were injured in a train crash, and Diane is one of the victims, and he ends up miraculously saving her, even though it seems like she's dead. And then he proposes to her, shortly after. So now he has a fiance to provide for, so he goes to his friend Aubrey from earlier for work, and he agrees to travel with him to Africa on a dangerous archaeological expedition, where our hero will have to face unknown dangers, supernatural mysteries, and maybe even betrayal from his closest ally. So I thought that this book was really good, but in doing some of my research, I found out that some people don't really like it or think it's that well written. I disagree. I do admit that the pacing is a little bit weird at times, and there are some random plot holes, but I think that's kind of because it was originally serialized, and I think it can be the same with a lot of earlier TV shows. Before you could just binge something on a streaming service, a show would have to be appealing to an audience who might not be invested for the whole plot, but just interested in tuning in for an episode. So the final product can feel a little bit weird when you watch it all together, but that wasn't how it was intended to be consumed. So I think you have to be kind of forgiving with that. And this book is the same way. It's really fun to read, and the underlying themes are really interesting, especially when you look at it in historical context. So I mentioned before, the main character is mixed, but he passes for white. And this kind of leads to him feeling isolated and lonely because he rejects his heritage to avoid like discrimination. And then throughout the book, like especially through his romance with Dianthe, who is also mixed, Hopkins explores the themes of race and identity with the idea that people are all of one blood, which is of course the title of the book. I think that there's some pretty obvious similarities when you're looking at these two books. Both of them were serialized and published in magazines by like politically active authors. And of course, magazines like that were really influential for abolitionists in the antebellum period when our first book was published, and then later for civil rights activists during the Jim Crow era when the second book was published. And actually, some of Delaney's writings, who's the first author, were also published in The Liberator, which is really interesting. But as well as publishing their works in magazines, Hopkins was the editor for one of these magazines, and Delaney started his own newspaper later on. So these books were like originally published chapter by chapter in these like Black owned and operated newspapers and magazines. So like Blake's revolutionary attitude or Rael's struggle with identity and discrimination would have been like really relatable to the readers, like and to the intended audience. And if you end up reading these books, I would really encourage you to consider what these books would have meant for the intended audience. All in all, I think that these books are like a great way to enrich your understanding of Black history. But even if sci-fi isn't your jam in whatever genre you would enjoy, I would encourage you to take some time and look back to its origins. Like you can find a Black author who is breaking new ground and read one of their works, considering the historical context. It's definitely worth it for your understanding of history, but also for your appreciation of the genre.